2 years ago, I moved to a new city to start my first job after graduating from my undergraduate degree. I was excited, and then suddenly, second wave of the pandemic hit, and I had to work from home. I had already moved to that city, and I already lived there, so I was bored. I decided to start taking videos with my new iPhone camera, and I realized there was no one outside to take a video of. When I was outside, I decided to find people that would be interesting to film and make a short documentary series. And luckily, in the central park of The Hague, there was only protesters, lots and lots of protesters. And I chose the most peculiar ones to film. And when I say peculiar, I mean people who we wouldn't usually empathize with, people who we would otherwise see as different from views than our own. And I'm going to introduce you to the man that started this journey through a series of pictures and quotes from them. So in this cold, desolate winter, I first approached something in the distance. I don't know if you can all see it. He was holding a block of ice when I first met him, and he was building an igloo. His name was Kasper, and the first thing he told me that caught me completely off guard was that he had just completed a hunger strike that lasted for 10 days, and he had returned from the hospital, and his organs started failing. He told me that he sold his home, all his belongings, and he had quit his job as a consultant in the Ministry of Internal Affairs of the Netherlands, a 6-figure salary, and he decided to live his life in protest of the Dutch government. He believed he uncovered a conspiracy that the government was planning, and I quote him, a genocide in slow motion. According to him, the pandemic was a plan to keep the rich growing richer, and the vaccines were there to reduce our immunity to the new variants coming up, and the virus was created in a lab for population reduction. He said he discovered all of this not because of the experiences he had through his job, but he said that he went through something he likes to call a Kundalini spiritual awakening. And I'm not sure how many of you had that before, but what it means is you die spiritually of some sense, and then you go to the afterlife and you realize everybody around you is going to die. And then the entire world's plan was, as he realized during that state, that while we're alive here, the governments will wage a spiritual war against God, and that all the gods were the same. He said he was waiting for people to gather. He said he was waiting for 4 million people to gather around his igloo, and he was going to wait there until the time came. So Kasper was one of the many peculiar people during a very, very turbulent time during the Netherlands. There was an upcoming Dutch general election in the next few months. There was a total lockdown, and one of the first times in the country's history, a night curfew. And this was all happening during a global pandemic. There was an eruption of protesters across the political spectrum continuing for months, and thankfully, I documented a lot of them. People who were out there speaking about refugee rights, people who were anti-vaxxers, anti-globalists, people on the right and left, and everything in between. This journey kind of informed me to ask a lot of questions in my media degree at the LSE, and it led me to ask certain questions. In a society where we are becoming increasingly fragmented, everybody is going to have a perspective in a free society with their own free access to information. And how can we actually report on those views people have in a way that we can understand them? How is it that we can talk to one another and express their perspectives and not just our own perspective? And could there be a role that the news and reporting could have that could be reimagined? Is there a way to reconceptualize our notion of objectivity as a way to use empathy to rethink how to report in what I will define as a post-truth age? So our institutions have been based on ideas from the European Enlightenment. And it's an idea of human nature that says that human beings are fundamentally rational, and all of our institutions are organized and planned according to principles that are considered rational. And the idea is, organizing a society according to these rational institutions, people will be able to follow and act within these institutions, and we would have a society where we can minimize as much risk and as much damage as possible. Now, in a free civil society, which means that a civil society where people are free to speak about their ideas and gain information from wherever they want, when people are able to make their own choices, these informed, rational citizens will make rational decisions based on access to free information. And that information will be objective and rational because of the free press. And once they make these rational, informed decisions, they vote. I'm going to show you the next group of pictures, and This is a wall of security forces in the exact same park. This is months later, the snow has already melted, and it looks like Kasper's prophecy may have come true because the park was flooded with people. The wall of security forces were there to divide the two protest groups from each other, and anybody who would cross that line from one protest to another would be arrested. And here you could see signs saying mild virus, killer vaccine. You know how visible it is. These are the people who call themselves the pro-freedom protesters. They didn't believe in government regulations, they didn't believe in the lockdown measures, they did not believe in masks, and they most definitely did not believe in vaccines. At this point, Kasper's igloo had already melted and he was nowhere to be found. Well, this is actually a funny slide. So basically on the right-hand side, you can see the sign that says maintain social distancing in a crowd full of people who don't believe in the pandemic. I don't know, I think the irony was missed there anyway. So I looked for the I looked for the least intimidating person I could find in the entire crowd. This is the first time in my life I felt peer pressure for wearing a mask, because clearly I wasn't one of them for many other reasons. So I found this young lady over here who seemed very friendly, and so I asked her why she was here. What she said was, we're here because we've been subject to a coup by our government. We're forced to not be able to see each other anymore, and most of these masks don't work, and we just want our freedom back. So all of this was sounding very familiar again. So what I thought of all of this was, at the time especially, that it was strange how there was a pandemic that was a shared universal experience, that every single country and every single person in the world had to somehow go through because of the similarities it had. We had to all, have an extra mask in our pocket in case one mask wasn't actually going to, something happened, the thing broke or whatever. And we all had to do those really annoying Zoom calls, and there was a certain shared sentiment of understanding one another and understanding what other people were going through. Filming these protests, I realized the exact opposite was true, because the interpretation of these events and the understanding of what these events meant made it so that the pandemic revealed that people are not going to understand one another even if they have a shared experience, because they're living within their own worlds, and then when they came out, they expressed sorrows and interests that couldn't relate to the other protesters, to the point where security had to separate them. This happened more than once, and I was trying to understand why they couldn't relate to one another. So, the old paradigms that I described about human nature seem to have not explained this very well for me, because these rational assumptions that we have about human beings they're not broad enough to encompass the fact that truth can constantly be reinterpreted, and there's many, many different versions of it now. And a partial answer to this, and it's important to bring this up, is that information and the way we receive information has become decentralized heavily due to the internet. And you might be asking, why does reporting come into all of this? Well, because, as I said earlier, the opinions that people form are based on the information that they receive. And objectivity was an ideal that was used to make sure that the information is presented in the most unbiased way as possible. The problem is now, it's only made to look like this information is as unbiased as possible, because everybody is presenting the information in the most unbiased way, and therefore everybody who consumes that information is going to keep believing that their information is the most unbiased. So it hasn't really helped the problem. This is another incident I'd like to share with you. I asked the two gentlemen if I could take a video of them. If it's not glaringly obvious already, it says the media is the virus. Just wanted to show off a little bit of my Dutch skills. And so basically, when I asked the gentleman if I could video him, he said one of the most interesting insults I've ever heard in my life. He said that, "I don't like your Moroccan newspaper either." And then I had to think about that. I was like, well, I was fascinated by this, because, well, let's analyze this. So the dominant immigrant group in the Netherlands are Moroccans, and he probably saw my complexion, he thought I was Moroccan, so this wasn't just a racial slur. "I don't like your Moroccan newspaper." He assumed I was a journalist. And that also made me think for a second, because, so based on the fact that I could possibly be filming him and I could be Moroccan, I must be part of the mainstream news that does believe the pandemic is real. And this is one of the important things that we learn when you study media. No matter how reliable your news source is, that news source is someone else's fake news. And fake news is not a term that can be used for only a certain kind of news source. There is always going to be a group of people that would name something fake news. And, okay, moving on. So, again, we use the words post-truth, which is Not the center of this talk, but definitely something that will make us understand how information is now received. Post-truth society is a society in which public claims are more important for them to be fact-checked. So public claims are received from the news, and the key thing about these claims are they need to be fact-checked as to whether they're true or not. That's the main focus now, and this is because of a growing distrust in all of our institutions that has taken place in the last decade. So this is an illustration that I made, and please forgive me, I'm really not a designer, and that's not my forte. But it should be a simple enough representation of the idea that the ideal civil society would look something like this, and this is the Habermasian idea of a public sphere, in which people would talk to each other and then make rational choices through rational discussion, and then be able to conduct democracy. It's a deliberative democracy is the model. And you have different kinds of people here, as I represented very, very clearly, that would be talking to each other. And they're clearly of different political lines and of different political ideas. It should be clear enough. But in reality, this is what it really looks like. This is a bit better, isn't it? More circles. But the thing is, so everybody is reaffirming their preconceived biases and staying within their own groups. And within their own groups, there is a circulation of information that defines that group, in which they'll reaffirm each other's views. And the problem is, whether these people realize it or not, they're all still within one bigger circle. They're all in the same place. They're just choosing not to interact with other people or understand other people's perspectives. So now, how do we solve this problem? And the problem is, not only are they not listening to each other, usually they believe that other people are misled, or worse, they scapegoat them as a source of the problems. So we need to reimagine the role of objectivity. That's what I came to realize. In order for us to actually live together in a free society with free access to information, we need to represent perspectives that are different than us, and this is the task of the journalist, of the reporter. And why? Because if the journalists are watchdogs of society, one of the things that is a precondition in a society with access to free information is the ability to accept or humanize a person that's different from you, and that is a task a reporter has to take on. We need to first make sure that different groups in society do not fragment further, because this is the biggest problem of our time in terms of social cohesion. We do not have a solution for this. So what I propose is perspective-driven objectivity, which is somewhat similar to the idea of objectivity, except we're focusing now on the opportunity here to reimagine the role of a journalist who fulfills the role of threading together disparate people across geographies, across cultures, across political lines. Now, how would he use then objectivity to create perspective? Instead of claiming how he is reporting or she is reporting is objective, we have to first understand the perspective of people who are being reported on as objectively as possible. It could even be thought of as context-based objectivity, as into how can different people whose views we don't agree with, how did they end up believing what they believe now, and what are their position in the broader context of society? And this allows the journalists to remove their political affiliation or their own personal biases or the editorial board's personal biases from what they're reporting. Because rationally understanding perspectives is a lot more difficult than just empathy. It requires a lot of legwork in terms of understanding and investigating how certain views came to be. This is much harder than it looks. For example, somebody coming up to you saying a racial slur about what your news sources are and assuming your political affiliation, you have a choice to actually denounce them completely or try to actually approach it with curiosity. And this is, again, something that we have to try to imagine in our own stead. Are we comfortable with people who don't believe that the vaccine is real? Are we able to actually accept that there may be a distrust that actually has a valid source or understandable source? And if this was possible, if this was easy at least, we would have already done it, and it's not. But I do think that changing the way we think about it is an important start to rethink how objectivity should be used with an updated idea of human nature. So as promised, we're going to come back to the two protests. This is the last anecdote. So I told you about the ones who were on the, well, basically, literally on the right, but also people who were pro-freedom protesters. There was another group of protesters on the other side. And had anyone crossed the threshold, they would be hit by a water cannon. And I had to convince them that I was just a guy taking videos, and somehow they believed me. So basically, this was the climate march, a group of people believing that the pandemic, as real as it is, the climate crisis was still the biggest problem to tackle. And something really interesting happened here that I didn't expect, right? So the young man on the left was sitting with a sign essentially saying he's going to vote for this far-right party, change my mind. This is a climate-denying far-right party. Now, I thought that somebody was going to get into a fight with him, but then somebody from the protest, who was on the right-hand side, had sat down with him and then told him about why he believes it's important to actually vote for a party that supports the climate crisis, right? They talked to each other for about 15 to 20 minutes, and I captured 5 minutes of it on camera. In the end, they exchanged contact information, right? And they promised each other that they were going to share each other's sources. And while you may not agree with the guy who came to the other protests and crossed the line to say this, I think he was extremely brave. Because now they may not end up agreeing with each other, but they most definitely understand why the other person believes what they believe, and that is the most important thing. And that's sometimes enough. So from everything we learned in the last decade, from the polarization of society with elections, with disinformation, and with the case study about the conspiracies thought about regarding the pandemic, all of this is, I think, a problem that can be solved with a new understanding of journalistic impartiality that goes beyond partisanship and has the potential to heal the fractures in the institutions that the pandemic revealed. Reporting on people's perspectives can make us empathize with each other a little bit more. And I want to leave you with, I said this was the last anecdote, it's just the last picture, but I want to leave you with this last image of what it looks like if we shelter ourselves from each other's views and decide to bury ourselves within our own perspective, our igloo of ignorance, and we really can't afford to do this much longer. We don't have a choice because no matter how much we decide to disagree with each other or not talk to each other, we're actually all living within that same igloo, and the igloo is about to melt. Thank you very much.